This free presentation is brought to you by Quantum University.
I have a confession to make. Even though I've been really associated with the power of intention, I actually didn't believe it. I had a lot of skepticism about it. I'd heard about the law of attraction and the secret and all sorts of things, but I had just inconvenient questions. What can you do with this besides get yourself a parking space? Can you manifest something besides great wealth, as they were saying? What about curing cancer with your thoughts? And what if lots of people are thinking the same thought at the same time? Does that magnify the effect? So I decided what I would do would be to test this. As a journalist, I'm interested in evidence and proof. And so I thought, I'll test this to the limit. I'll see if we can actually determine whether intention can do something major in the world. So I thought I'll put together all of the scientists I know from my work and my many readers around the globe, and we'll have the largest global laboratory in history. So that's what I did in 2007. I set up the intention experiment. And I was kind of dubious as to whether it was going to work. The whole idea was to have scientists set up a controlled experiment in a laboratory and every so often have my readers or audience, when I was speaking somewhere, send an intention to that target in the laboratory. And we did all sorts of things. We did seeds and water and even trying to lower violence. And it worked. It really worked. In the 30 experiments we've done to date, 26 have shown measurable, mostly significant effects. There's no drug out there that actually can claim that kind of track record. So for instance, we did lots of experiments we started small with leaves and seeds. We did one really ingenious experiment using 4 sets of seeds, 30 seeds each. I was working with the University of Arizona. Wherever I was traveling in the world speaking, I would get my audience engaged in one of these experiments. We'd choose which target seeds we were going to send to. We wouldn't let the scientists know which one we'd chosen. After we'd finished, they would plant all 4 sets of seeds and then 5 days later measure the results. And every single time we did this, whether I was in Sydney, Australia, or Los Angeles, California, or Rhinebeck, New York, or even inviting my audience over the internet, every time the seed sent intention grew significantly higher than the controls. So let's just unpack this for a second. Think about it. My audience in Sydney, Australia, that was the first one we did, had 700 people in the audience. We sent intention to seeds that were in Tucson, Arizona, 8,000 miles away. What this really suggests is that there is some sort of psychic internet. And it also happens virtually because when I invited my audience all over the world to come on my website and do the same thing, we also got similar results. The other interesting thing about this experiment was that we weren't sending intention to the thing itself, we were sending intention to a representation of the thing, its photograph, and yet it still worked. But that's not the point of the story. We carried on with this. We did all sorts of water experiments. Dr. Schwartz, Gary Schwartz and I from the University of Arizona did a whole bunch of experiments trying to change the energy footprint of tap water into that like bottled water. And as you can see, tap water has a very distinctive footprint, energy footprint, that you can measure, which is essentially the light going through the water. And bottled water has a very different one. And our intention, just our thoughts sent to that water produced a very different energy footprint, much like bottled water. We decided to work with another lab, Penn State University, and this time with one of the world's experts on water and materials science, the late Rustum Roy. Now, Rusty Roy was very interested in the idea of cluster structure with water. The idea that those H2O molecules attach together in different configurations. Think of a Lego set. And these water molecules come together like different pieces of Lego, depending on the purity of the water. That was his theory. And his theory was that healing water, like the water at Lourdes, had slightly different cluster structure than ordinary tap water. So we wanted to know whether we could change the cluster structure. So we sent intention to do it with a very sophisticated piece of equipment called a Raman spectroscopy. And what this does is measures light going through water and sees whether or not we change the hydrogen-oxygen, the way the hydrogen-oxygen bonds behave toward each other. And it was amazing. That experiment demonstrated just in the time we sent intention, that 10-minute window, the light dimmed. And we can actually see it on a chart. But that's not the point of the story. We carried on and tried to do this in a live setting with Lake Biwa, working with Masaru Emoto in Japan. Lake Biwa, the largest lake in Japan, which is also polluted. I got actual samples of the water, this time working with the Russian physicist Dr. Konstantin Korotkov. We sent intention with our audience and simultaneously my audience over the internet to one of the glasses of water. And we moved its pH, its alkalinity versus acidity, by an entire pH, which would suggest greater purification. And we also showed through his GDV equipment, the equipment that measures light coming through things, that there was a major change in intensity and spread of light. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story begins in Chicago at my first workshop. About a year after I started these intention experiments, I started wondering whether or not I could scale this down to a group of people, and how would it work if we were going to do intention in a workshop setting. Now, I come from an investigative reporting background, so I don't run workshops. I'm not a personal development trainer, so I didn't really know what to do. So I thought, right, we'll put them into groups, small groups of about 8, and we'll ask them to send in healing intention to each other and see what happens. And I thought we'll elect somebody in the group, and then the whole rest of the group can send healing intention to that person if they have some sort of health challenge. And I figured it would be something like a facial, a feel-good exercise, nothing much more. And my husband, who's a natural headline writer, said, hey, I like that, the power of 8. And more or less, we were making it up as we went along. And I expected, as I say, it'd be a little bit like a meditation effect. Well, and here it is. I put them in groups and thought this is what would happen. That's not what happened. What happened, essentially, was that the next day when they came back, it was more or less like the lame were walking. When they came back to describe what had happened to them the next day, I gave them the mic one by one. They went up and talked about their experiences. And it was no more insomnia from one person, no more knee pain from another person. Somebody else who had had headaches their entire life said they'd vanished. Somebody else had suffered from IBS for years and that was gone. Someone else who was chronically depressed said her depression had lifted. As my 20-year-old daughter usually says to me, WTF, what the bleep was going on here. I was really overwhelmed by it and also frightened by it. I did not like this. I'm not a healer. I'm not somebody who ever does this. I'm a journalist. Nevertheless, wherever I ran this workshop, all over the world, and I went from there, I went to Dubai, I went places all over the world. Whenever I ran these workshops and put people in little groups of 8 and asked them to send healing intention to one of the members of the group, amazing things happened. There was Hetty in Marsden, who had such bad arthritis in her knees that she had to walk step by step by step. And she came back the next day in our workshop walking normally. There was Laura's mother in Denver who had scoliosis and said she was pain-free after our little experience, an immediate response. And the next few months, her daughter wrote me to say that her mother was feeling so much better and her back had straightened so much that they had to change the mirror in the rearview mirror of her car. There was Paul, who had a hand in a brace when he came to my workshop in Miami, couldn't move it. He had injured it. The next day, the brace was off and he was wiggling it in front of us. It was absolutely normal. There was Daniel, who had curvature of the spine so badly that he was affecting his breathing. And during the intention, he said it felt like his back was elongating and he was able to breathe better. There were hundreds, maybe even thousands more over the years, and I hated it. As any good journalist can tell you, I buried the lead of the story. I thought that it was going to interfere with my scientific work trying to prove intention. So I ignored it, I apologized for it, and I didn't want to do anything about it. I didn't understand what Rosa was trying to tell me after being in part of the group when she said, I felt like I was giving and receiving healing, like I was healing myself. So I carried on with more intention experiments. This time I wanted to do something huge. I was a little sick of leaves and seeds and water, and I decided what I'm going to do is try to lower violence in a war-torn area. Let's do something big, I told Dr. Gary Schwartz. So we looked around the world for a war, and it's very hard to get actual statistics because nobody likes to talk about the bodies in a war. But we finally found one, the 25-year war that had been raging in Sri Lanka, where we could get statistics. And my scientific team, which I'd assembled, wanted to have a long statistical tale. So we needed 2 years' worth of violence data before and the ability to get violence data afterward. So we sent intention over 8 days. And after that, death and injuries fell drastically. Death rate fell by 74%, injury rate fell by 48%. And I had a statistician called Dr. Jessica Utz analyze it, looking at what had happened over the 2 years before and then the several months afterward, and to model what should have happened if it carried on as normal from what it had done before, compared to what actually happened. And this is what happened. You can see the little green bar demonstrates where violence should have been carrying on to go up, but it actually fell. And we asked Roger Nelson, the head of the Global Consciousness Project, who has those random event generators dotted around the world to measure what is going on during moments of collective mind. We asked him to measure just during those 10 minutes of our intention over the entire week and to see whether his machines, those random event generators that operate like a modern-day electronic coin flipper, that usually have a random process of heads and tails roughly 50% of the time each. So we asked him, see what happened during that week. And he discovered those machines moved off their random course just in those 10 minutes of our intention every day. That's not the point of the story either. The point of the story occurred when I surveyed the participants of that experiment to find out how they'd got on. Mainly I was asking whether or not they had been able to get onto my website. We had about 15,000 participants from something like 60, 70 countries around the world. And I surveyed them afterward to find out what happened. And this is what I got. It is as if my brain is wired to a bigger network, wrote in one. I felt like I stepped into a palpable stream of energy along my arms and hands, which felt like it had direction and force and mass. My whole body was tingling and I was having goosebumps. I felt a strong current in my body. It was like a solid magnetic force field all around me. Sort of like what I imagine it would be like to be locked in a tractor beam, like is described on Star Trek. Remember, folks, people were just sitting in front of their computer screens, participating in an experiment that was being run on my website. And these were the responses, and I had thousands of them. It stopped soon after the experiment ended. participants reported other things. They reported that they were closer to their loved ones. They were closer to strangers. They were healing their relationships. They had a new life purpose, a more peaceful life. They were hugging strangers. Once again, I said to myself, WTF, what is going on here? What are these experiences? It's as though all of my people had been hypnotized into an altered state. So we ran a healing experiment a few years later, this time with a Gulf War veteran named Todd Voss, who had post-traumatic stress disorder. Was so hypervigilant, he had to sit against a wall when he went into a room with his back to the wall so he could see what was going on. So we ran an experiment, this time trying to lower his alpha waves. According to neuroscientist Dr. Jeffrey Fannin, who was running the experiment, we needed to create more of those alpha waves, those slower brain waves like in meditation that calm people down. So my audience around the world, on their internet, on their computer screens, sent intention to increase Todd's alpha waves. And you can see we had a big result. All of those turquoise pieces of those little heads on the right-hand side demonstrate that he had more alpha waves afterward. And after the experiment, I heard from Dr. Fannin, he didn't need any help anymore with his PTSD. He went traveling. He ended up marrying a year later and ended up having a family, having a son. But that's not the point of the story. The same things did not occur with one of the senders whose brainwaves we were measuring, and also one of the controls whose brainwaves we were measuring too. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story had to do with the people who were participating, the people who were sending intention to Todd. When I surveyed them afterward, I got information like this. Pain in the knee is completely gone. Regular digestion for the first time in 20 years. No longer experiencing sciatic pain. Anxiety and panic attacks have disappeared. Continuing improvement to skin condition. I had relief in my hip as if I had taken some pain relief. It wasn't, it seemed, the effect on the target. The real point of the story was the effect on the participants. Again, I didn't know what to make of this. I ran another peace intention experiment, this time for the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I was pretty tired of those buildings coming down every year on the anniversary, and I wanted to offer up an alternative. And this time I thought I'll partner with a guy called Dr. Salah al-Rashid, who is like the Deepak Chopra of the Middle East. He is a peace advocate, and he's also brought personal development to the Middle East. And he's hosted me a number of times speaking there in numerous countries around the Gulf. So I asked him to invite his followers to be involved in an intention experiment for peace. We were going to send intention to 2 provinces in southern Afghanistan, the 2 provinces that were the stronghold of the Taliban. And I invited my Western readers and my followers from around the globe to participate too. Once again, we ran this over the internet. We started with Dr. al-Rashid apologizing for the Arabs in not being vigilant in preventing 9/11, and we apologized on the behalf of the West for our outsized response to 9/11, which ended up in the killing, deportation, detaining, and injury of more than 100,000 innocent people. So we sent intention to those 2 provinces. And I got my information straight from a German general who was part of NATO. And his information, which were the official statistics from NATO, and then I got more information from the UN, demonstrated this is the longest sustained downward trend in enemy-initiated attacks recorded by NATO. Here's some of the information about what happened after our experiment. Casualties drastically fell. Civilian casualties by 37%, enemy attacks by 12%, attacks in the Southwest by 29% over the whole of 2010 and 790% in September. And this was compared to the 2 years before. Attacks across the entire country dropped 9%. Did we do this? Short answer, who knows? There are many variables in a war, and they were even winding it down. Same thing with the Sri Lanka experiment. Did we do this? Who knows? Too many variables to say conclusively it was the power of our intention. But that wasn't the point of the story either. The point of the story was what happened to the participants afterward. I had a daily broadcast going at the same time as this experiment. And the Arabs and the Americans began Facebooking and instant messaging each other. They began befriending each other. And after a while, they began forgiving each other. In fact, one said that this was really powerful for him, a real way of forgiving 9/11 as an American citizen. We ran another piece in experiment, sending intention to what I thought was going to be an attempt to lower violence in the most violent place in America, the US Congress. So we had sent intention to 2 counties just around the Capitol building. We looked at the data for 2 years before, and I waited a whole year to look at the results. And lo and behold, just at the point we sent intention, violent crime had been surging, and it started going down and went down by 33% over that year. The same thing did not happen with property crime, which kept going up. So the violent crime, which we'd focused on in lowering violence, bucked the trend. And most interestingly, talking about the effects on individuals, the very next day, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Speaker of the House, hugged John Boehner, the current Speaker of the House. And so I thought, they're mortal enemies, something amazing happened. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story, once again, was the participants. And I started recognizing that maybe intention has a mirror effect. Maybe it isn't that effect on the target so much as the effect on the participants. And if the participants were sending intention for peace, their lives seemed to become more peaceful. If they were sending intention for healing, they began healing themselves. So the journalist in me wanted to find out why this is happening. So I began looking at old esoteric types of practices. When else had healing circles been used? Where had it begun? So I looked at the largest healing circle of all, Stonehenge in England, and I spoke to some of the archaeologists who had done digs around Stonehenge, and they explained to me that Stonehenge actually was an ancient lord's, that people went there to be made well. They found this with a lot of the bodies that had been buried around there. And he thought that the stones held significance, the stone circle for them, these ancient peoples, but he wasn't sure whether or not people in a circle also were important. So I spoke to all kinds of experts, a guy called Jeff Levin who studied all kinds of religious healings and esoteric healings, and Larry Dawsey, who's interested in healing mind. No one could talk to me. No one knew an antecedent for this kind of rebound effect, this mirror effect, where the senders of healing also receive something themselves. They certainly knew about prayer circles. Teresa de Avila is credited with creating the first prayer circles with the Catholic Church. But no one knew anything about that. Where did it start? So then I found, in my looking and my searching, an old sermon by a minister called Charles Spurgeon. And he had talked about the fact that there had been this kind of mistranslation in the Bible in the Acts, which talked about how the apostles set up their church and their first actions after Jesus had ascended. And whenever they were talking about their praying, they talked about the fact that they were praying with one accord, as the King James Version said it. Now, that's a fairly anemic translation for the original Hellenic Greek, which is a word called homothumadon. That was the adverb they used to talk about how they prayed. And what that means is almost like a symphony, ecstatic unity, coming together with a single voice. It is like a Beethoven symphony with different instruments, all coming together for a collective sound. And what he was saying was that whenever Jesus had asked the apostles, whenever they were praying, to pray passionately in one voice. I also was fascinated to see that maybe the whole idea of 12 was really important, because one of the first things the apostles did was replace Judas, who had, of course, betrayed Jesus and had hung himself. Now, everybody has always assumed that the 12 stood for the 12 tribes of Israel, but maybe there was something in the number itself. Maybe it was more like a power of 12, a small group creating some sort of amazing resonant effect, because the Acts also talks about the apostles healing as a group together and having all kinds of success. Maybe the way that they could heal was only by praying with one voice. So I was starting to get really interested in this and thought, I've got to study this a little bit more. So I decided to create a petri dish of my own. I invited among my audience people to be part of a year-long masterclass, and I limited the numbers to 250, and I taught them some things about the power of intention, and then put them into groups of 8 and observed them over an entire year. And I asked them for feedback month by month by month, so I could see, would their lives begin to heal? Would they have individual healings? Would they have changes in their life purpose? Would their careers change? Would everything in their lives begin to heal? And within a few months, I got answers like this. Patty Rutledge, that's not her real name, I'm disguising her identity for a number of reasons. She came to the group with 15 years of chronic fatigue. She could barely exercise. After 5 minutes, she would be exhausted and have to lay down for the rest of the afternoon. One of her big intentions was to get healthy. And within a few months of working with the group, she started to discover some of the issues that may have contributed. She had black mold, something like 150 times more than normal. She had heavy metal, and trying to deal with some of that, nothing much changed. In the usual way, she went to all kinds of alternative practitioners. She also developed 2 breast lumps, so she and the group started sending intention for that. Within a few months, those breast lumps melted away, and soon after that, Patty was inspired to check on her liver glycogen stores and discovered one of her liver filtration systems wasn't working. She also discovered the source of black mold, which was just in her house, just behind her dressing room where she was every day. She changed that, fixed that. She got some treatment for her liver glycogen system, and her chronic fatigue was over. Right now, she does all kinds of, she lifts heavy weights, she's got her health back, she is energetic, she can even hike. Then there's Mitchell Dean, who came to the group with lifelong depression. He just leaned towards sometimes really serious depression, which was very difficult for him as a clinical psychologist. And he's an integrative practitioner, so he treats with all kinds of a whole toolkit of alternative treatments. Nevertheless, it wasn't really working 100% for him. Somehow, with the backing of the group, he was inspired to look a little closer as to the cause of his depression. And he found also one of his liver systems wasn't working. As soon as that was fixed, he started saying to the group, golly, I feel a whole lot better. Now, what was it about these groups that caused these amazing effects? Both Patty and Mitchell said there was something about making a vow, a public statement to that group, to look further and to try to heal, that inspired them to get to the root of the problem. There was something magical in that group that provided this kind of support, and also the idea of somebody being there for you. And remember, these groups were just meeting virtually. They didn't meet in person. They were people scattered around the globe who were set up and only meeting by Skype or Google Hangouts, and yet they were having this effect. But for some people, they weren't getting anywhere. So I was inspired in the middle of the year to say, get off of yourself. Stop having the group intend for you. Get the group to intend for other people, and you intend for other people. And I had a particular person in mind. Young Luke, 15 years old, had broken up with his first major girlfriend, and in a fit of adolescent existential angst, threw himself off a 40-foot structure onto hard ground. Miraculously, he survived. This is probably what he looked like. But everything in his body was broken. All of his bones, he had a brain injury, he had nerve problems, he had double vision. He was a complete wreck, and the doctors didn't think he was going to live. So I set up a healing vigil for Luke, and I asked members of these Power of Eight groups to send weekly intention to Luke. Within a couple of weeks, his stepfather, Michael, who kept a running commentary on Luke, told me, Luke is so much better. The doctors are amazed by this. His attitudes have completely shifted, and they corresponded to just the times we were sending intention. Within a few weeks, he was bombing around the hospital on his wheelchair, and even back on his tablet. His friends came to visit him on his birthday, and they had a great time together. And within a few weeks more, he was back home. There he is with his dog. Now, was that good doctoring or the result of our intention? It seemed to correlate with the times we were sending intention. But short answer, who knows? Many variables in there. But all I can say is it wasn't the placebo effect. Luke, like any typical 15-year-old, thought his parents' belief in the power of intention was stupid. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story has to do with the participants who were setting up this healing vigil for Luke. Andy Spiros, her life just wasn't working at the moment. She didn't have enough income coming in, was always worried about money, and also was getting a divorce. She and her husband were separating. Everything looked dismal for her, and nothing was working. The group tried all kinds of strategies. We even tried to take her back to early seed moments where she might have felt inadequate or a scarcity about money. Still didn't work. And then Andy began being part of that healing vigil for Luke. And the very next week, she got information about a brand new job that would give her the income she needed. It turned out to be a perfect fit. Then she even moved on to a better job soon after that. Lisa Wheeler. Lisa had joined the group because she wanted to write a book. As a bodywork practitioner, she thought she had something really amazing to say about healing trauma. But she'd never written a book before, she wasn't a writer, and she was terrified of the process, and really terrified of the marketing, and of being shot down by reviewers. So her book was going nowhere when she joined the group. And it wasn't really progressing with the group's help of intention on her. But then she started focusing on one of the other members of the group who had serious financial issues. She got completely off of herself. And that very next week, once again, she happened to walk into a store. There was someone who she recognized, who actually was a former publisher. Well, it turned out she also loved being a writing coach. So she offered to coach Lisa through the entire process and to help her get the right marketing people. And by the end of the year, Lisa had finished her book, Engaging Resilience, and it became a #1 bestseller in several categories on Amazon. So I was really fascinated by this whole effect. What is intention actually? And how far does it go? Is there a kind of a scattergun effect? Is it trespassing everything we think about? So I worked with Dr. Konstantin Korotkov, who used his GDV machines to study some of the people in a workshop of mine being sent intention. And he found amazing things of lowerings of stress level in the 10 people sent intention. And you can see clear differences in the before and after. And there's chakra alignments, which he was able to measure with his equipment by extrapolating through computerized system. He found there's the before, and their chakra systems are all over, their alignments are all over the place. And there they are afterward. Huge difference, huge alignment. He's also looked at the effect of intention on the environment with a little contraption, as you can see here, that he playfully calls Sputnik, after that first Russian launching into space, because of course Dr. Korotkov is from St. Petersburg, Russia. So his Sputnik is what he calls an integral environment analyzer, which is like the Global Consciousness Project rolled into a single machine. It measures human emotions on the environment, and what he looks at is essentially atmospheric changes in relation to changes in people. So it picks up the environment's ability to store charge. It's called capacitance in engineering. And it's extremely sensitive to changes in any kind of electromagnetic fields, which occur anytime we have a change in emotion. That affects our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and that in turn affects the environment. So in March 2017, I had my audience in Miami send intention to a jar of water sitting in Dr. Korotkov's lab in St. Petersburg, Russia. And we sent intention to the jar to change the jar, and he had Sputnik going. And you can see through that red bar, that, through our very careful timing, demonstrated a total lowering of charge, a calming in the room, just at the 10 minutes of our intention. So after all of this information, I wondered, what is the biology here? What's going on? Why are we having these amazing healing effects? And I got the answer when I started looking at the biology of goodness. I spoke to a guy called Dr. Dr. Keltner, from the University of California at Berkeley. He has studied a thing called the vagus nerve. As you can see, the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. It starts at the base of our skull, and it kind of winds its way through all of our major organs. But one of its real purposes is to essentially turn on feelings of connection. It helps with certain sympathetic nervous system compounds that slow us down and calm us down. And it also is involved in the release of oxytocin, which is the love hormone that gets released when we're feeling feelings of love, when mothers are taking care of their children, etc. And so this is essentially the love nerve. So Dr. Keltner and a graduate student of his decided to run an ingenious experiment where they were investigating how this love nerve gets turned on and what are its implications and what happens afterward. And so they took a bunch of Berkeley students and divided them into two groups. One group was given photos of the world's suffering, pictures of starving children, et cetera, and the others were shown pictures designed to elicit pride, pictures of their own campus, their football teams, even their rivals at Stanford University. An interesting thing happened. The people who were shown the world's victims, their vagus nerves went into high gear, whereas the other ones, where it was designed to elicit pride, they didn't. And more interesting than that, with the people looking at the world's victims, when their vagus nerves were turned on, it was demonstrated that they felt a greater connection to all of humanity, particularly people who were not like them. If they were Democrats, it was Republicans. If they were wealthy, it was the poor. They connected. They felt a greater global connection. Whereas the people shown pictures designed to elicit pride only felt connected with the people like them or people they aspired to, professionals, lawyers, doctors, etc., the wealthy. So this gave me a little clue as to why our Muslims and Americans started forgiving each other when they were involved in that 9/11 intention experiment. Maybe that altruistic act of sending intention in a group for something, lowering peace in a war-torn area, would activate all those systems to create greater connection with the other, with the enemy. I found some other information also when I started to study prayer. And I was really fascinated to come across the story of George. Now, George had a brain cancer, a glioma, one of the deadliest. And he knew as a biochemist that he had at most 2 years to live. So he was looking for a miracle. So he started going to charismatic church meetings, the ones run by Randy Clark, and he followed them around like a dedicated groupie, each time putting himself in line to be healed. And this went on for months, and he even attended some of their missionary trips, going to also stand in line every time when they were overseas. He was in line waiting to be healed. When he got home to his doctor, he was dismayed to find out nothing. No change. In fact, the tumor was progressing. But George was so interested in what was going on with the missionary churches and their little missions that he decided to volunteer, and he went with them. And he was so fascinated by some of their successes that he began to start praying for other people. And when he came home, he started doing this so much that people started lining up to get their little dose of prayer from him. And something amazing happened. After a while, when he went back to his doctor, they found his tumor was shrinking. And before long, the tumor was gone. Now, Randy Clark wrote about George, as did a woman called Candy Brown, who had actually documented cases like his. She was a scientist and documented it in a book called Testing Prayer. Clark believed that George's remission came about because of all the prayer that was given to him, almost like a bank account accruing a certain amount of interest. I don't see it like that. I see that George's change, his miraculous healing, came about the moment he started praying for someone else. And I found that when I started looking into other studies of prayer. There'd been a study done by a priest, a psychologist called Sean O'Leary, and he wanted to see whether or not prayer could help with something like depression. So he asked for volunteers who were depressed in his area in California, and he gathered together over 400, and he divided the group in half, and half were the ones being prayed for, and the other half were the people doing the praying. When he was all finished with the study, he found that the people who'd got prayer were less depressed. They were doing well. But the people who had done the praying were doing even better. They were even less depressed. And he had to conclude, I guess that praying is better for you than being prayed for. And that's certainly the case when you start looking at research about altruism. In every regard, altruism is like a bulletproof vest. It activates all kinds of things in your body that help your immune system, that make you feel, more connected, and you are healed. People improve their life circumstances. It sort of radiates out with an amazing ripple effect. In every case, the person doing the giving does better than the person doing the receiving. And that gave me a kind of a heretical thought when I started thinking about intention. I started thinking about whether or not the entire self-help movement is a little bit dangerous. It's all about I want, I get when you talk about intention. But there was a study that really spoke to that. It was looking at people who were very affluent, who lived what we'd call the good life. You know, they had plenty of holidays, they had all the money they needed, they had all that material success. When they looked at their immune systems, it was a disaster. These people had terrible immune system markers. It looked like they were going to be dropping like flies. They were perfect candidates for Alzheimer's, cancer, heart attack, you name it. They then looked at another group, these researchers, and these people had less money, they were less affluent, but they had a very focused life purpose. They weren't pleasure seekers, they were purpose seekers. These guys had totally robust immune systems. These guys were going to live forever. And so I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, maybe it is, I get sick. Maybe that's not the use of intention we should even be thinking about. Maybe it's not about, we know that we've heard about it since we've been children. It's almost like a Hallmark card, do unto others. Well, maybe we have to also start to think unto others too. So one of the things that was really interesting to me about looking at all of my participants in my intention experiments is that they'd all undergone what really looked like an altered state. They'd entered into what is generally defined as a mystical state. I mean, and Abraham Maslow and many others have defined these peak experiences or mystical states as having essentially 5 components: a palpable feeling of energy, an intense altered state of some sort, a feeling of oneness, of compassionate love, some sort of blinding epiphany of meaning afterward, where everything in the world makes sense to you all of a sudden, and also feelings of total rejuvenation, like you're living your life over and you're doing it miraculously for the first time. My participants were recording every single one of those things. And when I looked at evidence by Dr. Andrew Newberg about mystical states of nuns in ecstatic prayer and Sufi masters in the middle of their in their mystical states, he found a global quieting of mainly 2 areas of the brain: the parietal lobes, which are the part of the brain around here that governs our sense of self versus not self. It helps orient us in space, and it tells us where we end and the rest of the universe begins. Also, it looked like a quieting of the frontal lobes. Now, part of the frontal lobes, the right side, also controls things like worry and doubt and things like that. Well, that was turned down too with these Sufi masters. So he found that there is a blurring, essentially, between me and not me. And so suddenly that would account, or at least be a signature, of this ecstatic state of oneness. So I was really interested in this, and I thought, it's time to look at my own Power of 8 groups. Let's do a study. And Life University gave me an opportunity to do this by putting their psychology and neuroscience departments at my disposal. So we ran an experiment with 6 groups of novice Power of 8 people. And I put them into groups. All they had was a 13-minute video from me, an introduction. Some of them had meditated, but not much, and none of them knew anything about group intention. We put them into those groups, and in every case, we put a QEEG, which is a brain state measurement that's very well accepted, that looks at different brain waves and is able to quantify what's going on, which brain waves are fired and which aren't, and which parts of the brain they're fired on. So we put that in each case on one of the senders. And afterward, and here's our study, and this kind of gobbledygook essentially means this: a global quieting of the frontal and parietal lobes. And also we had a quieting of temporal lobes and occipital lobes, which have to do with visualization and hearing. Our participants, and these are people who had never done this before, this was one time, entered into a state of ecstatic oneness. There was only one thing I could conclude. Getting into a small group and sending group intention is a fast track to the miraculous, because this doesn't take years of priming or practice like a Sufi master has to undergo. It doesn't take a whole bunch of priming and getting ready like you might do if you're in prayer. It doesn't take a meditative state. It doesn't take ayahuasca. It doesn't take a sweat lodge. It doesn't take putting your head between your knees. All it takes is a group, a small group, intending together, and it's a passport to the miraculous. Before I leave you, I want to remind you that my book, The Power of Eight, is released September 26th. It's just been released, and I invite you to find out much more about what I've talked about today, and also about how to create your own Power of Eight group and how to do it. And you'll find hundreds of cases of people who have been transported to the miraculous, whose lives have changed, who have healed lifelong illnesses, who have found their dream jobs finally, who have found their life's purpose, who have healed their relationships. And it's not about years of psychotherapy. It's all about the magic of the group. I'm also running an American Peace Intention experiment to demonstrate this amazing rebound power. I'm running it over 6 days from September 30th to October 5th. And we are targeting a city of high violence in America and attempting to lower the violence. Now, I hope we do. I hope we do. But the bigger plan here, the bigger reason for doing this, is to try to unite the participants. I'm interested mostly in the active participation, the miraculous changes that happen as being part of this giant group. So please join me. It's free for everyone. And if you just check out that website, gaia.com/power-of-8, you can join and you'll start getting information about how to participate and which URLs to press. It's over 6 days, half-hour segments, and you'll learn lots about the Power of Eight too. Don't forget my books, the Field Trilogy, as I call them. The Field, which is the scientific overview of all of the new science, the Intention Experiment, how to use your thoughts to change things, and The Bond, how to live this. And also, don't forget my magazine, What Doctors Don't Tell You. It gives you all of the information and the lowdown on what works and what doesn't work in alternative and conventional medicine. It's evidence-based, it's written in language, and it gives you the skinny on everything. I have just one more thing to say about my Power of Eight groups and what I've learned over these years. My little groups, that year-long masterclass carried on miracle vortices of healing. Allison Maving had vitiligo when she started, and she began repigmenting. Marian McCashin, she was at the very far reaches of Canada at a dead-end job as a lab assistant, and she quit her job and became a therapist, and it's now the best job she's ever had. Yoli wanted to start her own business. Her husband had never been supportive. Suddenly it turned around completely, and she's created a new business and become an entrepreneur. Bev was down to her last 200 pounds. She's from England. When suddenly a huge windfall came from Lloyd's of London, enabled her to set up her website, Love Your Mark, which is all about people who have birthmarks like her, teaching them to accept and love themselves. Mitchell Dean, he not only cured his depression, he got down to his fighting weight, his high school weight. He overcame his writer's block, and he created a new healing modality that got picked up by a celebrity. Melissa, she was in a dead-end job in her mid-50s, and suddenly, when she started sending intention for someone else, she got an amazing offer for the job of her dreams, and also used intention to sell her car for just the right amount. Trudy regained some of her hearing. Andy went through a model divorce, so much so that hers and her husband's lawyers wanted to know how they did it so they could create their own model of collaborative divorce. And on and on and on. Of the people who stayed in their groups all through the year, pretty much 100% of them had some major transformation. What are the odds against chance of that occurring as the inevitable result of events over time? Did we do that? Had we actually done any of it? Short answer, who cares? I no longer ask that question. All of this has satisfied the doubting Thomas of me. I've become a reluctant apostle of the miraculous healing effect of small groups. C.S. Lewis had a wonderful quote that speaks to people like me. The miracles are in fact a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. It was too large for me to see, and now it's impossible for me to ignore. But what was it? Was it intention? Was it the power of the groups? Was it altruism? Or maybe was it something else? My intention masterclass people say the group, they cry when they think about the group. Many of them are in touch every day, even though they've never physically met. As one put it, it was as if we became one brain together. The group focus felt like a soup that changed my brain. Now, I think there's something magical in the power of small groups. The idea that you make a vow to a group, it gives you that wind at your back to carry on. The idea that you know a perfect stranger has got your back. The power of someone else saying, I will be your witness. When I think of all of this intention work, I think of what essentially Jesus was trying to tell us. Don't play small when it comes to working on your life. Always seek power in numbers, and specifically, the power of 8.
Are you ready to take your health and wellness career to the next level? Have you always dreamed of having a career in natural medicine? Do you need to expand and protect your professional health practice with proper credentials? Then take the next step and start an exciting, successful and meaningful career by enrolling in an online degree program in natural and integrative medicine at Quantum University.